My name is Dr. Caitlin Youngquist. I own Dirtworks, a soil and compost company in Worland, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to source quality compost, the questions you might want to ask, and how you can go through the process of ensuring the compost you are bringing onto your farm is going to meet your needs and be of high quality. The first question I would ask is, what are you going to be doing with that compost? So are you going to use that compost as a soil amendment in the fall, incorporated into the soil, for example, in vegetable or forage production? Or are you going to use it to make a potting mix or a seed starting mix, or to use it in your greenhouse? And so those will be the first questions to ask, and that will help determine the quality of compost or the maturity of compost that you may need. Compost that's used on a farm field or applied in the fall and incorporated into the soil, it's much more forgiving, so it can tolerate you can tolerate the use of compost in that case that maybe is less mature or potentially higher in salts, which are nutrients. If you're using the compost in a greenhouse or in a seed starting mix, making your own potting mix or seed starting mix, it's very important to ensure that the compost you are using is very, very mature and very low in salts. So one of the initial assessments you can do on your own place, if you're making your own compost especially, is smell. Does your compost smell like ammonia or sulfur? Both of those are indicators that the compost is either not mature or it's in an anaerobic state. So does it smell a little bit swampy, or does it smell like ammonia? Ammonia will tell you they're still losing some nitrogen, volatilizing some nitrogen, and instead of that smelling like ammonia, it should smell earthy and more like a good earthy soil. So that's one initial assessment you can do in the field for yourself. Another initial assessment you'll want to look for is contaminants. So are there rocks? Are there pieces of baling twine? Is there plastic? Are there other contaminants in that compost that you do not want on your farm? So that's, again, another initial assessment that can be done just with visual, by looking at the compost. Then we can also start to look at what's going to show up in a lab test. And so if you're going to be buying compost from a compost facility, be sure to ask for their lab analysis. And then that lab analysis, they should be testing for nutrient density, salts, potential contaminants, potential herbicide contamination, the dry matter, percent moisture, a variety of other parameters. So be sure to ask for that lab analysis before you invest in a large amount of compost. Salts are an interesting challenge in Wyoming. So we talk a lot about having high salts in our soils or having high salts in our manure-based compost. So it's important to understand that salts are also plant nutrients. They're just in excess. And so salts in this situation are a positive and negative ion that are dissociated in water. So some examples of that might be potassium nitrate, magnesium sulfate, sodium chloride. All of those are salts that dissociate in water into individual ions. The salts are not an issue until they're in the soil solution. And then what happens is the plant is not able to absorb water through its roots because the osmotic differential is no longer correct. So when people say the salty compost that's high in salt, for example, their plant or fertilizer, their plants look burned, that's because the plants are not able to absorb water out of the soil. So in that case, it's important to understand the salt level or the nutrient level of your compost. Manure-based compost will typically be higher in salts, which means it's higher in nutrients, and so it should be used in a certain way, whereas a green matter or a yard waste or a plant-based compost will typically be lower in salts, lower in nutrients, and can be used in larger quantities. So understanding what your situation is and what you need. For example, a manure-based compost can be a very efficient way to get a lot of nutrients on with the compost because you don't have to use as much to get the same amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and some of your micronutrients. But if you use too much, it can be hard on the plants or hard on the soil. That's especially important in a greenhouse situation because you don't have the rainfall, the limited precipitation that we do have in this state that will help push those salts down into the soil. So those are some of the things to think about when it comes to salinity of compost. So remember, a manure-based compost is going to be higher in salts and higher in nutrients typically than a plant-based or a plant matter-based compost. The composting process does a great job of breaking down most herbicides due to the microbial activity in the compost, the heat, the fluctuation in pH, and a variety of other things that happen in the compost pile. However, there are a few classes of what we call persistent herbicides that will persist, not only persist, but actually accumulate in the compost. And those are the ones that if you read the label on the herbicide, it will tell you that it persists for 3 to 5 years in soil. So it's very, very important that we don't get those into our compost system. And if we do, we test for them very, very carefully before they leave the compost yard and go into the soil or onto the farm. Now, your compost supplier should be testing for these persistent herbicides, but you can also do it yourself, and it's a very simple process. It's called a bioassay, and what that means is you take the compost or the manure that you're going to use and you grow some sensitive plants in it, preferably in the winter or early spring before you apply it to the farm, and then you determine the quality of the compost based on how those plants grow. And the best plants to use for that are beans, because they are extremely sensitive to these persistent herbicides. The herbicides that fall into this category are growth regulators. This means that they inhibit the growth of the plants in a certain way, and so you'll notice, the symptoms you'll notice is kind of a twisted, mutated, curled leaves. And that will tell you that there is some growth regulator contamination in the compost or the manure that you have. Again, it's a very simple test. You can do your own grow test, and be sure to ask your compost supplier as well if they do bioassay tests on the compost. Herbicide contamination in compost is actually quite rare. The challenge is that once it's in your soil, it's very difficult to get rid of, and it takes a lot of time and biology and sometimes some additions like biochar to remediate that soil. So keeping it out of the soil in the first place is your best bet. One final thing to check on the laboratory analysis for compost that you get from your compost supplier is for pathogens. And in particular, what's tested for a compost analysis is your fecal coliform, salmonella, and E. coli. And that just ensures that the manure that's gone into the compost has gone through the time temperature requirements that are needed, and pathogens are below any level of concern. If you maintain a farm food safety plan, and be sure to keep the records and ask your compost supplier for the records needed to meet those standards, which is making sure that it's met the time temperature requirements throughout the compost process to reduce and eliminate pathogens. If you're making your own compost, you need to keep the same records again for the farm food safety plan. How long it composted, what the ingredients are that went in, and the temperatures that were reached during the compost process. Compost is a very valuable, very helpful soil amendment, especially in Wyoming where our soils are so low in organic matter. It can really help build the soil organic matter, increase nutrient availability, exchange capacity, water holding capacity, and really just help you as a farmer care for your soil and produce more food. But there are just a few pieces to think about as you're sourcing compost that I want you to remember. Think carefully about salts and nutrient density and how you're going to use that compost. Make sure you're using the appropriate compost for the use that you want, and think carefully about potential contaminants, asking for the test results, and doing your own bioassay before you invest in a large quantity of compost. For more information about compost and sources of compost around the state of Wyoming, you can visit the Wyoming Food Coalition website, wyfoodcoalition.org, or you can visit our website, Dirtworks Wyoming, dirtworkswyo.com, and we have some resources on our blog as well. We wish you the best of luck growing food in Wyoming and encourage you to join the work of the Wyoming Food Coalition and connect with other growers and consumers around the state.